Yes, Ms. Barrett.
Good morning. Ms. Richards has asked me to correct on her behalf something she said yesterday during the evidence of Lord Waldegrave. When looking at HMTR 603_043, a minute dated the 3rd of December 1991, from Mr. Dixon at the Treasury to Mr. Grice and the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Ms. Richards suggested that the handwriting beginning, "This is a long-standing dilemma," might be that of Mr. Mellor, but said that she would check. Having checked, the initials indicate that the handwriting is that of Mr. Grice and not Mr. Mellor.
Thank you.
This then is a presentation on the role of the Chief Medical Officer. There is a written note on that topic which has already been disclosed to call participants and is published on our website. The presentation today won't cover everything that's contained in that written note. Our focus for today will be on the Chief Medical Officer's role in the response to AIDS over the 1980s. That will involve considering in some detail the actions taken by the two Chief Medical Officers for England during that period, Sir Henry Yellowlees, who held the role until the end of 1983, and Sir Donald Aitchison, who commenced in post in October 1983. So there was a 3-month overlap between them. As with other presentations, our intention is to provide a neutral and factual narrative which brings together relevant documents for your attention and for the attention of core participants. I should add that the written note itself is not exhaustive either. Core participants and the inquiry team may well identify further documents relevant to the role of the Chief Medical Officer as the inquiry progresses. A roadmap then for today is to start with a brief overview of the role of Chief Medical Officer and its responsibilities. Then we will go on to a chronological exploration of the documents touching on the Chief Medical Officer's response to AIDS, which will include looking at the involvement of Sir Henry Yellowlees until the end of his tenure at the end of 1983, and then Sir Donald Aitchison's involvement after his appointment in October of that year, the introduction of antibody testing, the public awareness campaign, which Sir Donald Aitchison was heavily involved in, and the introduction of heat treatment for factor products, and a brief look at some documents on Sir Donald Aitchison's attitude to compensation for those affected. I will then come back at the end to make some overarching comments about two particular categories of documents. One is what's referred to as Dear Doctor letters, which were sent by the Chief Medical Officer to the medical profession from time to time. And the second category is the Chief Medical Officer's annual reports. Starting then with the overview of the role. The role of the Chief Medical Officer can be traced back to the antecedent post of Medical Officer to the General Board of Health, which was established under the General Board of Health Continuance Act in 1855. By the time frame relevant to this presentation in the 1980s, the role had at least threefold responsibilities, which were first, providing advice to ministers, second, providing public health information to the medical profession and the wider public, and third, providing leadership to the medical officers who worked at the Department for Health and Social Security, DHSS. To look at the remit of the role, A helpful description is contained in the Bsc Inquiry Report published in the year 2000, which is at MHRA 0031996. We can see this is volume 15 of that report, which dealt with government and public administration. Could we go please to page 36 of this volume? And focus on the second half of the page under the subheading, the Chief Medical Officer, CMO. We can see at paragraph 417, it's set out that although there were CMOs for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland advising their respective ministers on matters affecting those parts of the United Kingdom, the responsibility for advising the UK government on matters affecting the United Kingdom as a whole fell to the CMO for England. And the written note does touch on the roles of the CMOs for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, but today we'll be focusing on the role of the CMO for England and their interactions in relation to AIDS in the 1980s. Going on then to paragraph 418, the dates are given, and then this quotation from Sir Donald Aitchison, who was in post, as we've heard, from 1983 until his retirement in 1991. The observation is set out that the sheer scale and personal responsibility of the post seem to have dimensions which distinguish it even from some of the highest posts of all within Whitehall. And he said that paper comes into the CMO's office on a scale which normally applies to ministers rather than to officials. There was an abnormally heavy commitment to meetings, both internal and external, and essential representational functions and international work had to be dealt with. Demands being made on the CMO in the field of public health were unusually heavy. The relevance of this is that given the breadth of the CMO's remit, it would not have been possible for the CMO to be personally involved in every public health issue of concern. And one aspect that we have found challenging to investigate in preparing this presentation is to what extent the CMO was personally briefed on the issues relevant to the inquiry's remit. The inquiry has heard evidence from Dr. Hilary Pickles, who was in the AIDS unit during the 1980s or the later 1980s, that decisions about whether to escalate briefings on any given topic were often taken by the deputy chief medical officers or DCMOs. So often we see documents that are circulated at DCMO level, and it's sometimes difficult to ascertain whether the CMO, Chief Medical Officer, would have had personal sight of that document or not. Dr. Pickles' evidence, I won't cite it here, but it's at paragraphs 17 to 18 of the written presentation for those who want to look at the detail. Could we scroll down the page to paragraph 420 next, please? It's set out here that the post had a long history and carried a complex, varied and demanding portfolio of responsibilities. Unlike the chief veterinary officer, the chief medical officer didn't have oversight of an executive organisation. And Sir Donald Aitchison commented, while the CMO may offer guidance on medical or public health matters to all doctors or to directors of public health, neither he nor his predecessors, at least since 1919, have had a line management or any power of direction to doctors outside the Department of Health. And that observation of his is relevant to reflect on when we come back to this Dear Doctor letters that he did circulate to the medical profession, and we consider the extent to which it was within the CMO's remit to provide guidance, if not direction, to the medical profession. Could we scroll down next, please, to paragraph 4.22? It's also set out in this report that as well as having responsibility for medical and public health advice, the CMO was charged with ensuring that an adequate quality of advice was provided within the Department of Health by its professional staff. And until 1995, so throughout the period we're looking at today, he acted as the ultimate line manager for over 100 medical and around 40 scientific personnel. He was the head of the medical hierarchy in the department, which various witnesses have commented on ran parallel to the civil service hierarchy. And then just the last place to go to in this report, could we scroll to 4.24, please? Just at the bottom of the page. It's noted that part of the CMO's responsibilities was to produce an independent annual report on the state of the public health, which highlighted major issues where health had improved and where there was concern about health. And we will come back to look at some of those reports. The next document we're going to go to when considering an overview of the role is Sir Donald Aitchison's autobiography, which we have an extract of at WITN 0771088. This was his autobiography, it's sideways, One Doctor's Odyssey, published in 2007. The internal excerpts aren't sideways, just the front cover. Could we go to page 7 of the document, please? And could we focus on the paragraph in the bottom left-hand column, starting but at a time when parliamentary sessions? We can see just from the bottom of that paragraph, Sir Donald Aitchison stated that although he saw 4 Secretaries of State come and go, it was Norman, and then if we could go to the top right-hand, Fowler, thank you, with whom he worked for several years, who he got to know best. He says it was a productive partnership which included not only the largely successful policies, he says from the perspective of hindsight in 2007, for the control of HIV, AIDS, Legionellosis and Salmonellosis, but the revival of public health. And he praises Lord Fowler's success based on a rare capacity to choose the right priorities together with the self-discipline to pursue them single-mindedly to a conclusion. Lord Fowler has also given evidence to this inquiry, and his evidence really mirrors what Sir Donald Aitchison said in his autobiography. He said that the post of CMO had pivotal importance and talked about how much he'd relied on Sir Donald Aitchison during the late or mid to late 80s when they were focusing on the AIDS crisis. In relation to the relationship between the CMO and ministers, we've also heard from Dr. Diana Walford, who was a Deputy Chief Medical Officer, and she has given evidence that in the context of those parallel administrative and medical hierarchies in the DHSS, the CMO had access to ministers whenever he wished. So there was a bridge at the top of these hierarchies. The next document we'll go to is Sir Donald Aitchison's witness statement to the Bsc Inquiry, which is at MHRA 0011433. We've seen the report that was written in the year 2000. He gave this witness statement in the October of 1998 before giving, well, we can see at the top he was scheduled to give oral evidence in November 1998. And can we go to page 4 of that document, please? And focus on the bottom paragraph from the subheading, the role of the Chief Medical Officer. He there set out his view of the role as at that time. He noted that the Chief Medical Officer was the principal advisor on medical and public health matters, not only to ministers in the Department of Health, but to ministers in other government departments and to the government as a whole. And he reiterates the observation we've seen already, that the field over which the CMO is required to provide advice extends far beyond his own personal professional experience. He says it is therefore necessary for him to be supported by an extensive advisory machinery. In addition to a number of expert standing committees, he has at his disposal a panel of upwards of about 80 personal consultant advisors drawn from the top ranks of the medical profession and covering all the specialties. So the role of the consultant advisor is an interesting one. That was the position as at 1998, when the panel had developed and enlarged since the period we're looking at in the 1980s. And we can see that if we go to NHBT 0001065, which will be, when it comes up, the minutes of the Consultant Advisors meeting on the 27th of November 1981. And I go here to the first half of the page, please, just to demonstrate that the specialisms at that time, including apologies for absence, numbered just 7. But even at this time, when there were just 7 specialties represented, there was a consultant advisor for blood transfusion, who was at that time Dr. Gunson. This was his first meeting. He commenced in that role that year, replacing Dr. Geoffrey Tovey. And Dr. Walford, who, as I've mentioned, was one of the DCMOs, has given evidence that she found Dr. Gunson to be accessible and helpful as a consultant advisor and was pleased that he'd taken over the role. And the relevant evidence on that issue is set out at paragraph 23 of the written presentation. I don't go to it now. Sorry, I'm just going to go back, please, to MHRA 0011433. Which is back to the witness statement of Donald Davidson for the Bsc Inquiry. And could we go to page 5, please? And focus on paragraph 14 in the middle of the page, where Sir Donald Davidson said that the term Chief Medical Officer was a misnomer, as it implies that the CMO leads a national hierarchy, and says that while the CMO may offer guidance on medical or public health matters to all doctors or directors of public health, neither he nor his predecessors, at least since 1919, have had a line management or any power of direction. So this is coming back to the issue of whether there's a power to direct the medical profession. And he says that at best the CMO may be seen as primus inter pares. I don't have the Latin translation, I'm afraid, Sir Brian.
The first amongst equals.
First amongst equals, I'm grateful. They're free to accept or reject his advice.
The fact that he thinks it's a misnomer is I think, looking at one public view of looking at the word chief. My understanding from what you've told me in the written presentation and from what I've heard is that he was the chief medical officer in the sense that he was the government's chief medical officer. So as far as the government's concerned, he's their chief go-to when it comes to matters of medicine.
That's absolutely right. He's not chief in the sense of the top of the pyramid of the NHS and the medical profession, but he is top of the hierarchy in terms of medical advice provided to the government.
And that's why he had the equivalent role to a permanent secretary, being the top of the, if you like, the medical division.
Yes, that's quite right. And in the Bsc Inquiry Report, it's noted that he has the same civil service grading as a permanent secretary, so he certainly was of equivalent status.
And that would explain why he had the access at the top, not to the administrative division, but direct to ministers.
That's right. There was that bridge at the top of the hierarchy, just as a permanent secretary.
It's not really a bridge, is it? Because a bridge would suggest there's a link between the two, the administrative and the medical, whereas he has a direct route. So it's more a direct reporting line to the minister, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
So if there's a bridge, it's a bridge through the minister rather than to the administrative side.
Yes, it's more like the point of the triangle where they meet.
That's a better way of putting it. Thank you.
So that is really the overview of what the purpose and function of the role was, and we'll now go into some more of the detail as to what firstly Sir Henry Yellowlees and then Sir Donald Aitchison did. And in particular, in response to the emerging risk of AIDS. And we'll start, please, at NHBT 0001067. So this is a letter of the 9th of June 1983 from Dr. Gunson to Sir Henry Yellowlees. We've heard that Dr. Gunson was the consultant advisor for blood transfusion issues at this time. And this is the first document which the inquiry has identified, although that doesn't mean it's the first document there was, showing Sir Henry Yellowlees being directly addressed on the issue of AIDS. I'll go through and pick up on a few points.
He had authored, hadn't he, the 1982 report on the nation's health?
He had.
Did that not pick up on AIDS?
The first, I'm just going back to check, but my understanding is, and I think it's correct, that the first mention of AIDS in the 1982 annual report was published sometime after October 1983, because that's when the introduction by Sir Henry Yellowlees was signed off. And so in the chronology, we think this letter of the 9th of June 1983 would have come before he turned his mind to the content of that report, although we can't be sure, of course, exactly when it was drafted.
The difficult technicality there is he's reporting not on 83, when he signed it off, but on 82.
Yes, that's absolutely right.
So the question is, it's always a difficulty with reports published some months after the period upon which they're reporting is concerned, because you don't necessarily know whether what is said effectively bringing things up to date, or whether it is actually a report on what was known and what was done during that particular year.
That's right. We can't know, and it's impossible to prove a negative. So all we can say is, as at October 1983, when he signed off his introduction to that report, he had in mind that over the period of 1982, AIDS was an issue. But we can't know at what stage in 1982 or 1983 he was first personally involved in that issue.
But at least he had to be aware that it was an issue during that period.
Yes.
If not earlier, given some of the contents of his report.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, and that one supposes that a report of the length it was would have been drafted for him, particularly given what we've heard about Sir Henry from those who've given oral evidence. They would have a direct reporting line, probably, because they'd be civil servants of the medical division, up to him.
Yes, that's right.
So he might very well have been informed. The probability is he may have been, but we have no direct proof that he was. Is that the position?
That's the position. It's not suggested, couldn't be suggested, that he was not involved in the issue. All we can say is the first document we have identified so far, and we may identify further documents as the inquiry progresses. The first document we've identified so far, where he is in direct correspondence about the issue, is the document on screen from Dr. Gunson.
And I also imagine that he read the newspapers.
I would speculate, yes.
Well, it's the probability, isn't it?
Yes.
And the newspapers, speaking generically, would have alerted any reader to the fact there was something which was alarming people in the States, and people were worried about it in the UK, called AIDS, and that was before 83 dawned.
Certainly, and this letter refers to the considerable publicity that had been given in the press to the condition of AIDS. And if we look at the first paragraph, Dr. Gunson is very much addressing Sir Henry on an issue he expects he knows about. He's not telling him for the first time or anything like that. It may be that this is picking up on a conversation that they had earlier, but all we can say is this is the first document that we've identified.
And certainly Sir Henry didn't respond saying, "Oh, I never heard of this, tell me more about it."
No, unfortunately we don't have the response to this letter, but certainly we don't have anything suggesting he was in any way shocked or surprised.
Subject to submissions to the contrary and evaluating them, I think I would be bound to conclude that just as it appears to have been assumed by Dr. Gunson, that he knew very well there was something called AIDS some time before June 1983.
Yes, absolutely. We just unfortunately can't provide you with a better date for that earlier awareness. We're picking up some way into the story, but this is the first document that we have.
And I may also be bound to conclude, if that is the case, that he was aware there was something which might very well be a threat to public health.
Well, certainly if we look at this letter, that is something which Dr. Gunson is referring to.
Yes.
By this point.
Well, I've taken away from taking us through the letter, but thank you. That's helped to clarify my thoughts and put out there something. If anyone wants to come back and argue the contrary, they're fully welcome to do so.
Thank you. In this letter, then, we've looked at the first paragraph, which refers to recent attention in the press. If we look then at the second paragraph, we can see that at that time Dr. Gunson was telling Sir Henry Yellow-Lees that the etiology of the disease was not known, but there was a strong possibility that the syndrome was caused by a transmissible infectious agent, and in that context it had been implicated in the transfusion of blood and blood products. He told Sir Henry Yellowlees that in the USA, several patients suffering from haemophilia A had contracted AIDS and some had died, and all of those patients had received repeated, it says infections, but I think he means infusions of factor VIII concentrate derived from human plasma. And he refers to one case in England of a patient with haemophilia who was at that point suffering from a condition which fulfilled the USA definition of AIDS, and refers also to one other possible patient suffering from haemophilia who may have the syndrome. He goes on to say that although relatively few cases of AIDS had as yet been reported in the UK, the significance of the condition with respect to the transfusion of blood and blood products was twofold. And he talked about the importance of ensuring that persons in the high-risk group with respect to AIDS were not enrolled as blood donors. And he referred to the pamphlet, which was then being given out to prospective blood donors on AIDS. And then just over the page, at subparagraph 2, he highlights that approximately half of the factor VIII concentrate used in the treatment of haemophilia in England and Wales at that time was derived from plasma imported from the USA. He said that there was no alternative to the continuation of that policy in the short term, but he was flagging up a concern and went on to say that in the medium term, the blood products laboratory in Elstree was being rebuilt so that it would have a capability to make the country self-sufficient. He went on underneath the subparagraphs to say that AIDS was not a major problem in the country at present, and frankly, he did not know whether it would be in the future. However, it was being taken seriously in European countries. And then towards the close of the letter, he mentioned, if we could just scroll down.
Can we just go on in that paragraph? Because I notice it says, it's been taken seriously in European countries, and the ministers of the Council of Europe are to be asked to approve recommendations designed to minimise the effect of AIDS. Now, we've had reference to that and their conclusion elsewhere in the inquiry so far, but it's the sentence which then follows. These recommendations are not in general incompatible with the measures being taken in this country. It's a question of how one interprets that sentence. Really? Is he saying, effectively, those recommendations are what we ought to be doing, they're not incompatible with what we want to achieve, or is he saying we're doing what is sufficient to achieve the recommendations? Two different ways of reading the same sentence.
Yes, it's ambiguous. And for Sir Henry Yellowlees receiving the letter, he's been told in the subparagraphs above about measures which were being taken, including the blood donor leaflet and working to build capacity at Elstree. And then is being told AIDS is not a major problem in this country at present. The overall tone may lead to the interpretation that these measures are underway, or what we're doing isn't incompatible, but it's ambiguous. It's not clear which he is saying.
By talking about AIDS not being a major problem in this country, he must, I think, be concentrating upon what was his bailiwick, which is the supply of blood for transfusion from donors bled in the UK. Because what he's just said above that is we're importing half of what we need for those who receive blood products, and importing from a country where there is a major problem. So he doesn't deal with that, does he? Because he's, I suppose, concentrating, given his role, distinct from that of Dr. Lane in the blood products laboratory. His role is dealing with blood transfusions.
Yes, he was the consultant advisor for blood transfusions. He wasn't the consultant advisor for infectious diseases or epidemiology.
Or blood products.
Or blood products.
And he deals with that, does he, in the next paragraph? A bit?
He does, although you'll see that he refers to the press publicity, or some of it, being ill-informed and alarmist, which would tend to re-emphasise what he said about it not being a major problem. It's perhaps an issue of tone rather than what he's actually saying. But he does go on to say that there is going to be this meeting of consultant advisors on the 17th of June 1983, and he asks for it to be added to any other business so he can talk about the problems of AIDS in relation to the transfusion of blood and blood products and the measures being undertaken in respect to this, what he calls potentially fatal syndrome. So he's not saying this is the end of the matter. He's saying this is an issue which bears further discussion that he wants to address.
Yeah, so what the letter is really doing is saying, can I please raise something under AOB?
Yeah, that's the function of the letter. That's what he's asking. As I mentioned, the inquiry hasn't identified any reply from the CMO, and unfortunately we haven't identified the minutes of that 17th of June meeting, but we do know that AIDS was discussed at that meeting because it's referred to in a later letter. Could we go to NHBT 0001066, please? And could we go to page 2 of that document? So the page on screen is the reply. Page 2 is the earlier letter of the 14th of October 1983, and it's from Sir Donald Aitchison. And if you look at his sign-off just at the bottom of the letter, we can see that at that point he was Chief Medical Officer Designate. So we're in that 3-month crossover period where he has started to work at DHSS, and Sir Henry Yellowlees is still in post. So there was an extended handover period. And in this letter, Sir Donald Aitchison wrote to Dr. Gunson, you will remember that at the meeting of the consultant advisors in the summer, Sir Henry Yellowlees asked whether you would be kind enough to send a brief account of the advances in your specialty that have occurred in the past 5 years and the problems and opportunities which you can anticipate in the next 5 years. So he is there picking up on this aspect of his brief. And then if we go to... Sorry, I've lost the reference. We'll come back. There's a further document which says in terms that what was discussed at that consultant advisors meeting in the summer, there was a discussion on AIDS. Just lost the reference, and we'll come to it later in the course of the presentation. But we can see that this is a conversation that has been started and is ongoing. If we go next, please, to DHSC 0002 309_123. This is a document dated the 22nd of June 1983, so it's 5 days after the consultant advisors meeting. And we can see Dr. Oliver, who was one of the Deputy Chief Medical Officers, circulated a note saying, with the topic AIDS, saying, Sir Henry Yellowlees has asked me to provide some information on AIDS for Lord Glenarthur. I attach a paper prepared by Dr. Wolford, which gives the background and up-to-date position. We're at Lord Glenarthur's services if he would like to discuss the matter in greater detail. So we can see that Sir Henry Yellowlees was at that stage involved in requesting a briefing on AIDS to go to a minister. And the paper that was attached is at DHSC 0002309_124. So this is Dr. Wolford's paper prepared at Sir Henry Yellowlees' request. Could we focus on the bottom paragraph under spread of the disease, please? It was noted that the pattern was emerging of a disease which appeared to be transmitted predominantly by male homosexual activity, but also by heterosexual, I think it says, means. And then says, as a secondary method of spread, contaminated needles used by drug addicts and the transfusion of blood and plasma taken from donors carrying the AIDS agent account for the occurrence of AIDS in intravenous drug abusers, haemophiliacs, and recipients of blood transfusion. So the method of transition was highlighted. Could we go to page 2, please? And look at the second paragraph under AIDS in the UK. And we can see at that time Dr. Wolford highlighted that 12 confirmed cases of AIDS had been reported. There was one case of AIDS in a patient with haemophiliac who had received factor VIII concentrate made from USA plasma prior to 1981. And after that had received NHS factor concentrate made from NHS plasma. But it's noted there was, at that stage, uncertainty over that patient's diagnosis. And if we could go to page 3, please. And look at the fourth paragraph of that page. There's a discussion of FDA regulations governing the selection of plasma donors to exclude high-risk groups. And it's noted that the department's medicines and supply divisions were endeavouring to ensure that there would be no dumping of high-risk plasma products onto the UK market and seeking assurances from the manufacturers in relation to quality. And there's a note that heat treatment is being discussed, but there was at that stage no evidence that such material would reduce the risk of transmitting AIDS. Could we zoom out again and look at the whole page? Sorry, it was just the paragraph above that paragraph that I also wanted to go to. And it was noted that the greatest risk to haemophiliacs at present was from the use of factor VIII concentrate prepared from American plasma. And it was noted that at that time, despite the work being done to redevelop the blood products laboratory, 50% of the factor VIII concentrate needed to treat haemophilia would have to be imported, and it was mainly imported from the USA. So it was both those paragraphs that I wanted to draw to your attention, sir. So that was the state of knowledge in an internal DHSS briefing in the June. of 1983, following that consultant advisors meeting where Dr. Gunson had spoken about AIDS. And at this point, I will go to look at the annual report for 1982, which is at DHSC 0007004. Now, when we look at this document, the caveat is the discussion we've had, sir, about not knowing exactly when it was drafted. If we look at page 16, this is the end of the introduction, and we can see that Sir Henry Yellowlees was signing off after the end of his tenure as Chief Medical Officer. It's dated October 1983, and we know that his tenure ended at the end of that December. And then the first mention of AIDS in the annual reports is at page 70. And it's just the bottom paragraph of that page. And then once we've looked at that, we'll go over to the top of the next page as well. The inquiry hasn't been able to ascertain why he said, or why the person drafting it said, during the past 4 years, a new and frequently fatal syndrome has been described in the United States. As of 1982, AIDS had been described during 1981 and 1982. Even if we take it from the date of the sign-off towards the end of 1983, 4 years isn't quite right.
Well, I'm not altogether sure about that. My thinking is this, that in some of the documents which the inquiry has in its database, there is reference to the CDC in Atlanta having been aware that there had been the odd report. There'd been no systematic investigation of an immune deficiency striking people in the West, and some symptoms which, looking back, having identified that there was a syndrome in 1981, might be thought to be the same thing. That dated back in one of the documents that I've read to 79. So it all depends. The trouble with this report is, for the past 4 years, is that an estimate? From which time is it written? From 1983 or 1982? It doesn't report a particular year period. And it's true that in the medical literature, as far as we know, the first reference was on the 4th of June 1981.
Yes, that's why this had puzzled me, but I think your suggestion might resolve my puzzlement. If it's being written as at a perspective of the end of 1983, looking back and including early descriptions which were not notifications of a syndrome, but in retrospect and with hindsight, could be observed to have been consistent with what was later evaluated to be a new syndrome. That might explain what I had on first glance thought was perhaps a mistake or anyway a puzzle.
But it remains a puzzle because we don't quite know what the author had in mind, and bear in mind what Sir Henry says in his introduction. This was compiled and edited by somebody other than him. But there we are. There is an earlier reference, actually, I think, in the report, 10 pages earlier.
Could we go
about 10 pages earlier, I noticed.
To page 60.
So we just go back to it. It's I'm not sure if it's the problem is the electronic numbering, but I think to go back to 51 just to check.
So back one page. The electronic numbering is 8 pages on from the internal page numbering.
Because there is a description of AIDS and on. Right. Can we just take it through page by page? And I think we may come to some description. No, go the other way, please.
So we're at the start of the chapter.
Going up the numbering scale towards 100 rather than down.
So from page, what page are you on electronically?
We're on page
now?
48 internal.
So 50, are you on 56 electronic? So go back to the page you were just on a moment ago. Go forwards. Just go forwards page by page, please.
And on. And on. It's under the communicable diseases section.
So the next page is the start of the relevant chapter. And then in this chapter, if we could just go forward slowly page by page while we look for the reference that Sir Brian has in mind.
And on, please. And on. And on. That's it. Kaposi's sarcoma and AIDS. 53.
Yeah, thank you. So that dates 1982 as the beginning of surveillance.
That's by the CDSC, so that's the UK surveillance of what was an American discovery or realization. And it then describes how the data was collected, which is a matter of some interest. And then the paragraph during 1982 and early weeks of 83, case reports suggestive of the classical type of Kaposi's sarcoma were received, which suggests that in the UK there have been a number of reports of something which might be the syndrome. And it is now believed there is under-reporting of these conditions, of the researchers proceeding in a number of scattered centres. So you then have what's to be done in terms of surveillance. It's a little more informative, I think, than what comes later, isn't it?
Yes, and thank you for taking us there. It does show that measures were being taken in terms of surveillance, which were within the purview of the Chief Medical Officer, at least by the stage this report was compiled.
So the information he had, as reflected in this document, was that the information that was being collected by the regulatory or the surveillance authority in the UK was not properly reflective of the full extent of what was actually happening. And that might be important if one's looking at the degree of prevalence and therefore any supposed risk.
Yes, and the measures that it would be proportionate to take in response.
Absolutely.
If I just take us back then to electronic page, we looked at electronic page 70. Could we look next at electronic page 71 and look at the top paragraph? So just for context, for those following what's happening on screen, we were looking at the section in the communicable diseases chapter, and we're now in the sexually transmitted diseases chapter, which is why there are two entries in the same report. And here it's said that it's noted that there's over 1,000 cases reported in the United States, that there's a death rate of over 40%, that it's a serious and often fatal syndrome. where it says cases are now being reported in England and Western Europe, I think it's helpful, Sir Brian, that you took us to the earlier point where we could see the context of the reporting that was being set out in the report in relation to the UK. But what's interesting here is it says that the cause of the serious and often fatal syndrome is unknown, which was correct at that point. But the information that we saw in the internal briefings, which was a lot more detailed about modes of transmission, aren't at this stage being set out in the public report. And this is the last document that we have identified showing personal involvement from Sir Henry Yellowlees in response to AIDS. And I'll just reiterate that this may, or is likely to be, because we haven't yet identified the documents, or because he may have had oral discussions which are not recorded in documents. To an extent, it may reflect that matters were not escalated to him personally during this period, but we don't know as between whether things weren't being escalated or whether things weren't being recorded, or we just don't have the records. We don't know, but I do refer back to the earlier observation about the size of the Chief Medical Officer's brief and the fact that he wouldn't be expected to have been personally involved in every public health concern at all times. And there were other issues which he spearheaded and we know he focused on. So a history of the role of the Chief Medical Officer praises Sir Henry Yellowlees for successfully campaigning to have lead removed from petrol and for working through the World Health Organization to eradicate smallpox. So insofar as there were particular issues that he was focusing on, he is not known in the way that his successor, Sir Donald Aitchison, is known for focusing on AIDS. So I will move then to what we know about Sir Donald Aitchison's early response to the risk of AIDS. We've seen the letter that he wrote to Dr. Gunson on the 14th of October 1983 asking for advice. It might actually be helpful to put that back on screen if possible. It's NHBT 001066, and it's the second page of that document. So Sir Donald Aitchison, when he was appointed, was an outside appointment, while Sir Henry Yellowlees had been a Deputy Chief Medical Officer before being promoted to Chief Medical Officer, and that had tended to be the pattern for previous Chief Medical Officers. Sir Donald Aitchison was an outsider. He was previously Dean of Medicine at Southampton Medical School, University Medical School, and he spent some time in this 3-month crossover period familiarising himself with aspects of his brief. And we can see that it says he's looking very much looking forward to receiving the briefing from Dr. Gunson, and says kind things about how extraordinarily interesting it is to have colleagues, senior colleagues, to help him with these matters. Dr. Gunson's reply is at page 1 of this document. So a few days later, 4 days later, he wrote back, enclosing an account of the advances in the last 5 years and those anticipated in the next 5 years in blood transfusion. And that paper is enclosed, and it's at page 3 of the document. So we can see this is Dr. Gunson's briefing to Sir Donald Aitchison 5 years back and 5 years forward. And can we flip to the next page, please? Page 4, and look at the bottom 2 paragraphs under the subheading Disease Transmission. So Dr. Gunson is briefing Sir Donald Aitchison as he comes to the role that certain products have always carried the danger of transmission of hepatitis, and he talks about the introduction of screening for hepatitis B and the vaccine for that condition, and he flags the problem of non-A, non-B hepatitis, which remains, and says, and there is now the potential transmission of AIDS, about which I spoke at the last consultant advisors meeting. And this is the document which I didn't have immediately to hand, which shows that that was specifically discussed as he had requested of Sir Henry Yellowlees. And then could we go to the next page, page 5, and look at the heading, under the heading, the next 5 years. What Dr. Gunson told Sir Donald Aitchison would be the major advance that could be made, and he underlines it, is self-sufficiency in blood products for the UK. He noted that approximately 60% of Factor VIII was purchased commercially and was largely imported from the USA. And if we go over to page 6, please. So underneath the narrower paragraphs on the first wide paragraph on the page, he notes that it will be an advantage when all blood products can be derived from the UK donor population, but he notes that nevertheless the transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis, particularly from the products derived from pooled plasma, will still be a problem in groups of patients such as haemophiliacs who receive those products regularly. He anticipates a diagnostic test within the next 5 years, but it goes on to say that exposure needs to be minimised as well. And then he goes on to say, with respect to AIDS, it is too early to anticipate the effects in the UK, but it is important that every opportunity is taken to investigate possible ways in which the donor population can be screened. The next document we'll go to, please, is DHSC 0003823_173. And this is a briefing dated the 4th of November 1983, so about 2 weeks, just over 2 weeks after the letter and paper from Dr. Gunson. And we can see that it's a briefing on AIDS for CMO consultant advisors meeting. Now, we don't know, because it doesn't say which CMO this is for. The pattern of the documents with the preceding correspondence with Dr. Gunson and Sir Donald Aitchison tends to suggest it might have been for Sir Donald Aitchison, but it just says CMO, it doesn't give a name, and at this point in the chronology there were 2 overlapping CMOs. So with that health warning, could we have a look please at the second paragraph, we're there already, which notes CMO will already be well aware of the general background to AIDS. So Brian goes, bless you, goes back to your point that this was also a live issue in the press, and it would have been something that was part of the general fabric of knowledge and discussion, as well as specific briefings. Says there's little to report in the way of scientific developments. The definition is broadly accepted, although it's been modified in some countries, and goes on to say that no specific marker test has been developed. It says that cases continue to rise, with 24 notifications by then in Britain, including 2 people with haemophilia. And if we look at the fourth paragraph, towards the bottom of what's on screen, we know that there's intensive research activity in the USA and elsewhere directed at searching for the causative agent, as well as the basic immunology of the syndrome. So that was the state of DHSS internal briefing in early November of 1983.
It's 5 lines down. Although there is a fairly general acceptance for viral etiology. So
Yes.
that's the briefing note which has been given.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So it's not a definite certainty at this stage. They're saying the possibility of other causes has not been dismissed, but that is the generally accepted theory.
So most people think it's a virus.
Yes, yes. Oh, and if we look at the previous sentence as well, the question is also being asked as whether the pre-existing immune dysfunction allows infection by an AIDS virus or whether the agent itself causes the immune defect. So there was also a question about whether an inherent susceptibility played part of the causation of the syndrome, which, of course, we know later was not the case, but that was still something that was being considered at the time. And just in terms of internal briefings, if we could next go please to DHSC 0001966. So this is in February 1984. We've got another communication from Dr. Gunson. This time he's writing to Dr. Harris. He's one of the Deputy Chief Medical Officers rather than directly to the CMO. He appended a report, which I don't think we need to go to, entitled Plasma Supply for Self-Sufficiency in Blood Products. And essentially what he was doing was recommending that additional blood collection should be financed through the CBLA. So it was a request for financing to increase the collection of plasma in support of the goal of self-sufficiency. And then the reply is at DHSC 0046942_114. And this is Dr. Harris's reply of the 15th of February 1984. And we can see in the big central paragraph, he tells Dr. Gunson, "We're taking this matter extremely seriously in the department, and following discussions with Donald Aitchison and my DCMO colleagues, we've decided that a submission to ministers will be required to state the nature of the problem," and so forth. Now, in fact, you'll have heard in other sessions of this inquiry that the matter was taken forward by Dr. Harris through the NHS management group rather than via a submission to ministers. But I take you here just to demonstrate that we know that Donald Aitchison was personally involved at this stage in discussion. So this was something that the DCMO thought worthy of escalation to him as at February 1984. There is then another gap in the evidence that we have identified to show any personal involvement of Sir Donald Aitchison in matters relating to AIDS between February and October 1984. but I repeat the same health warning as with respect to Sir Henry Yellowlees. We don't know what that signifies. It may have been that, as this letter reflects, he was having verbal conversations with his DCMOs and other personnel in DHSS. It may be that there are documents we haven't identified yet, or it may be that his focus was elsewhere, but we can't draw that as a conclusion. There's just a gap in the documents that we have identified. So we pick up again in October of 1984. And could we go to DHSC 0002323_009? And what we see on screen here is a briefing minute from Dr. Alison Smithies, Principal Medical Officer in DHSS, dated the 19th of October 1984. And we can see that under the heading AIDS, it says the CMO has requested information about the problem of AIDS and blood donations. So this was in response to a specific inquiry by Sir Donald Aitchison, and he asked two questions. At A, when can we expect that no blood or plasma will be donated without prior testing? And then if we could scroll down just to see B at the bottom of the page, thank you. He also asked, what is the position about blood transfusion and plasma-related AIDS in the UK and its controls? If we go back up to the answer under A, please. Dr. Smithies responded to the question about when can we expect that no blood or plasma will be donated without prior testing, that so far only pilot studies had been carried out into blood donor testing for the HLTV3 antibody, and that there was a limited supply of test reagents so that the time frame for universal testing was uncertain. She said in the second paragraph, in the bit that someone's drawn brackets round at the end of that paragraph, could we highlight it? That it is felt that there is a danger in making this too public in the event of high-risk groups using blood donations as a means of finding out their HTLV antibody status. So that was something that was raised as a concern internally at DHSS at that time, that introducing antibody testing for prospective blood donors at blood transfusion centres could create an incentive for people who are at high risk to donate blood in order to access the tests. It's not stated that there was any evidence that that was likely to happen, but it was flagged as a concern. At the bottom of the page, we have the reply to the second question about what's the position about blood transfusion and plasma-related AIDS in the UK and its control. She told the CMO that they had yet no known case of AIDS reliably related to blood transfusion. There were about 40 cases in the United States. Officially, there were 3 cases by this point of haemophiliacs who had contracted AIDS. And then just going over to the top of the next page, please. One of them had sadly died. She said that in the view of the prevalence of HTLV3 antibody in haemophiliacs, which was about 35%, that it was likely that there would be more. So likely there would be more cases of AIDS in people with haemophilia. And she notes that the 2 cases which had arisen long enough ago to be well documented had received factor VIII from the United States, and they were the recipients of the same batches of factor VIII were being followed up through Dr. Krask of the Public Health Laboratory Service. DHSS had allocated research funds to assist Dr. Krask in that study. She also noted there was a concern about recent batches known to be associated with AIDS donors, one of which came from the United States and one of which was contaminated by a donor from Wessex. She told the Chief Medical Officer, and this is something that we see he took on board seriously, that the only protection recipients of blood and blood products had from contracting AIDS from donors was the publicity given to the possibility of transmission from high-risk groups. And she went on to explain that the risk was higher in large pooled products, or products made from large pools. And she mentioned the leaflet that was used to advise donors from high-risk groups to desist from giving blood, issued in August 1983, which was at that stage being redrafted. We can see the CMO's reply. Oh, actually, should we take a break and then we'll see the CMO's reply?
Well, shall we have the
after
reply
the break?
and then have a break?
Yes, it's at DHSC 0000569. It's very short. On the 25th of October 1984, the reply was sent with his comment, "It is agreed that we should move to the position where HTLV3 testing is put on the same basis as Australia antibody, i.e. negativity is a prerequisite for donation of blood or plasma. What's the timetable and cost?"
Yes.
So if we pause there for the morning break.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now until quarter to 12, and then we'll hear the next part of the saga.
Thank you, sir.